So, in the early 1970s, the CIA decided the absolute best use of your tax dollars was to play a $500 million game of arcade claw machine at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The official story? That billionaire eccentric Howard Hughes, yes, the guy who was famously locking himself in dark rooms and storing his own urine in jars at the time, had suddenly developed a burning passion for deep-sea mining. The government told the press he was building a massive ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, to scoop up manganese nodules from the seafloor. Spoiler alert, manganese nodules is just intelligence community speak for, "We are lying to your face, and you are too poor to question us." Nobody actually cared about the rocks. The rocks were the most boring cover story in human history, designed specifically to make journalists fall asleep, because while the media was busy wondering why a reclusive madman wanted a boatload of wet gravel, the US government was actually building a giant robotic claw to reach down 3 miles underwater, grab a fully armed Soviet ballistic missile submarine, and steal it right out from under the Russians' noses. But to pull off the greatest heist in naval history, they first needed to find the thing, and that involved listening to a sound that wasn't supposed to exist. Rewind to 1968. The Cold War is colder than a witch's, well, you get it. A Soviet Golf II-class submarine, the K-129, suddenly stops calling home. Naturally, the Soviet Navy panics. They deploy a massive fleet to the North Pacific, tearing up the ocean surface like a frantic frat boy looking for his lost iPhone after a blackout bender. They spent months searching, burned enough diesel to choke a dinosaur, and found absolutely zero, nothing. Eventually, they gave up, assumed the ocean ate it, and went home to drink vodka and look sad. But while the Russians were running around blind, the US Navy was sitting in a dark room wearing headphones, trying not to laugh. See, the US had secretly wired the ocean floor with something called SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System. Think of it as a baby monitor, but for the entire Pacific Ocean. They had heard a massive kerplunk on March 8th. They triangulated the noise and pinpointed the wreck to a precise location, 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. The prize? 3 ballistic nuclear missiles, and more importantly, the cryptographic machines. The code books. The literal admin password to the entire Soviet Navy. The US had the location. They had the motive. There was just one tiny microscopic problem. The sub was sitting 16,500 feet down. That's 3 miles of crushing black water. Nobody had ever recovered anything that heavy from that deep. The engineering required to lift it was technically impossible. So, naturally, the Navy called the only people crazy enough to ignore the laws of physics, the CIA. So the CIA takes the meeting, probably expecting a nice, easy coup in South America or something. Instead, the Navy slides a photo across the table and says, "We want you to steal a 2,000-ton submarine from the bottom of the ocean without anyone noticing." The brainstorming phase for Project Azorian was basically Wile E. Coyote trying to catch the Roadrunner. One scientist suggested filling the sub with pressurized gas to float it up. Another suggested injecting thousands of tons of buoyant wax. I'm pretty sure one guy in the back just whispered, "What if we used really big magnets?" Eventually, the engineers looked at the math and realized there was only one way to do this: a giant mechanical claw. They were literally going to build the world's biggest pair of pliers, lower it on a pipe string the length of the Empire State Building stacked on top of itself 6 times, and pinch the sub off the floor. But here's the kicker. You can't just park a US Navy vessel in the middle of the Pacific for 6 months and start cranking a winch. The Soviet satellites would spot that faster than a vegan spots a burger joint. If the Russians saw the US military hovering over their lost gravesite, it wouldn't be a heist, it would be World War III. They needed a disguise. They needed a cover story so elaborate, so expensive, and so uniquely weird that nobody would question it. They needed a frontman who was rich enough to build a custom ship, but crazy enough that building a giant mystery boat seemed totally on brand. Enter Howard Hughes. In the 1970s, Hughes was basically Elon Musk if Elon Musk lived in a penthouse with the curtains drawn, hadn't cut his fingernails in 3 years, and was terrified of germs. He was the perfect mix of filthy rich and absolutely unhinged. The CIA knocked on his door and said, "Howard, we need to borrow your reputation." And surprisingly, Hughes, a patriot with a flair for the dramatic, said yes. He gave the CIA carte blanche to use his company, the Summa Corporation, as a front. So, the press release went out. Howard Hughes is going to mine the ocean floor for manganese nodules. Now, ask yourself, do you know what a manganese nodule is? No, neither did the reporters. But they nodded along because, hey, if the crazy airplane guy wants to vacuum rocks off the seafloor, who are we to stop him? It was the perfect cover. If the Soviets saw the ship, they wouldn't see a military threat. They'd just see a greedy capitalist trying to make a quick buck. It exploited the Soviets' own bias against American greed. They built the Hughes Glomar Explorer in a shipyard in Pennsylvania, right out in the open. The public watched it being assembled. It was massive. It was ugly. It looked like an oil derrick had a baby with a cargo ship. But while the public was staring at the drilling rig on top, they completely missed the architectural insanity happening underneath the waterline. Because this wasn't just a ship, it was a floating magic trick. Most ships are designed with one very specific rule in mind. Keep the water on the outside. The Glomar Explorer looked at that rule and laughed. The ship was built around a massive internal hangar bay called the moon pool. Picture a sliding door in the bottom of the hull, 199 feet long. This allowed the crew to lower the massive mechanical claw, affectionately named Clementine, and pull the Soviet sub back up inside the belly of the ship, all while underwater. It was genius. To any passing ship or spy plane, the Glomar just looked like a boat sitting there. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, it was pregnant with a 2,000-ton Soviet war machine. But the engineering nightmare wasn't just hiding the sub, it was the pipe. They had to lower a steel pipe string, section by section, 3 miles down. Imagine standing on the roof of the Empire State Building and trying to lower a straw into a shot glass on the sidewalk. In a hurricane, if the ship drifted more than a few feet, the pipe would snap, Clementine would be lost forever, and $500 million would sink to the bottom of the sea. To fix this, they invented an automated thruster system that was basically the great-grandfather of modern GPS dynamic positioning. By 1974, the ship was ready, the crew was ready, the claw was hungry. They set sail for the target site, unaware that a Soviet tugboat was already heading their way to ask some very uncomfortable questions. On July 4, 1974, because nothing says America like stealing Soviet property on Independence Day, the Glomar Explorer arrived at the site. They stabilized the ship and began the excruciatingly slow process of lowering the pipe, section by heavy section, into the abyss. But just as Clementine was getting close to the bottom, a blip appeared on the radar. A Soviet naval tugboat. Panic mode? Absolutely. The crew of the Glomar had to switch from high-tech spies to blue-collar rock enthusiasts instantly. The Soviet ship pulled up right alongside them. I'm talking uncomfortably close. They were circling the Glomar, taking photos, and probably wondering why a mining ship had more antennas than a CIA listening post. The CIA agents on deck had to play it cool. They literally stood at the railings, waved at the Russians, and pointed at the water like, "Yep, just looking for rocks. Boy, we sure do love manganese. Can't get enough of the stuff." It was the geopolitical equivalent of a teenager trying to hide a beer behind their back while talking to a cop. The Soviets watched them for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Imagine trying to perform complex surgery while a bear breathes down your neck. Eventually, the Russians shrugged. They figured, it's just that crazy Hughes guy again, and sailed away. The coast was finally clear. Clementine latched onto the submarine. The hydraulics whined. The K-129 lifted off the seabed. Everything was going perfectly, until physics decided to punch the CIA in the throat. We've all been there. You're at the arcade. You've got the stuffed Pikachu in the claw. It's hovering over the chute. You can taste victory. And then, slip. The claw goes limp, Pikachu drops, and you're left screaming at a glass box in a sticky movie theater lobby. Now imagine that, but the Pikachu is a nuclear submarine and the quarter you spent cost $500 million. The lift was going smoothly. They had hauled the beast up nearly 2 miles. The pressure was easing off. The crew was probably already icing the champagne, but as the K-129 got about halfway to the surface, the structural integrity of the sub, which, to be fair, had slammed into the ocean floor and sat there for 6 years, gave up. There was a sickening jolt. Several of Clementine's massive steel fingers snapped. In slow motion, the crew watched the monitors as 2/3 of the submarine broke off, slipped out of the grasp, and plummeted back down into the darkness. And of course, because the universe loves irony, the part that fell was the back end. You know, the part with the nuclear missiles and the codebooks, the only things they actually wanted, gone. Back to the bottom. The Glomar Explorer was left holding just the nose of the sub. It was the intelligence equivalent of breaking into a bank vault and only stealing the pens from the front desk. They hauled the remains into the moon pool, heartbroken. But even a broken chunk of a Soviet sub isn't empty. When they cracked open the hatch of the wreckage they did catch, the mood shifted from disappointment to horror. So, the CIA dragged their prize into the moon pool, drained the water, and cracked it open. And what did they get for their $500 million trouble? Well, they did find 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, which is cool if you want to blow up a city, but useless for cracking codes. They also found some sonar manuals and logbooks. But the cryptographic machines? The golden ticket? Sitting in the mud 3 miles down, probably mocking them. Basically, they broke into the Kremlin and stole the janitor's bucket. But they found something else too. Inside the twisted wreckage were the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors. Now, this is where the story gets weirdly human. You'd expect the CIA, an organization famous for drugging hippies and toppling governments, to just toss the remains or ignore them. Instead, they did something incredibly respectful. They held a formal military burial at sea. They played the Soviet national anthem. They read scriptures in both English and Russian. They committed the bodies to the deep with full honors, filming the whole thing, just in case they ever needed to prove to Moscow that they weren't total monsters. It was a moment of somber Cold War chivalry amidst a massive illegal heist. But sentimentality doesn't pay the bills. The mission was a partial failure. The CIA wanted the rest of that sub. They immediately started planning Mission Matador to go back and get the missile section. They fixed the claw, prepped the ship, and were ready for round 2. There was just one problem. A burglar broke into Howard Hughes' office in Los Angeles looking for cash. But instead, he stole a memo. A memo that said, "Hey, remember that fake mining ship? You know how most government secrets are exposed by high-level defectors or master hackers? Well, Project Azorian was exposed by a random burglar in Los Angeles who just wanted some quick cash." In June 1974, thieves broke into Howard Hughes' Summa Corporation offices. They were looking for money, but instead, they grabbed a handful of documents. One of them just happened to be a memo describing the entire CIA operation. It's like breaking into a KFC to steal the register and accidentally walking out with the colonel's secret recipe. The CIA panicked. They went to the press, specifically the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times, and begged them, "Please, for the love of God, don't print this. We need to go back for the rest of the sub." And shockingly, the newspapers agreed to hold the story for the sake of national security. But then, journalist Jack Anderson got wind of it. Jack didn't care about the CIA's feelings. He went on national television and blew the lid off the whole thing. The jig was up. The Soviet Union suddenly realized that the mining ship was actually a grave robber. They immediately parked a fleet of warships over the crash site, effectively telling the US Navy, "Come near this spot again, and we start shooting." Mission Matador, the trip to get the codebooks, was canceled instantly. But the government still had to deal with the flood of questions from the public. Did you really steal a sub? Do you have the missiles? To handle this, the CIA invented a brand new legal phrase. A phrase so perfect, so vague, and so annoying that it's still used today. They released a statement saying they could neither confirm nor deny the existence of the operation. That's right, the Glomar response was born. It was the government's way of saying Schrodinger's cat, but for legal liability. So, was it worth it? In today's money, Project Azorian cost nearly $4 billion. For that price, the US taxpayer bought a rusty chunk of a boat, 2 nuclear torpedoes they didn't need, and 6 corpses they had to bury. It is officially the most expensive participation trophy in human history. The Glomar Explorer spent the next few decades drifting around like a retired celebrity, actually drilling for oil and minerals, ironically fulfilling its cover story, before being sold for scrap in 2015. But here is the final itch you can't scratch. Many historians and intelligence insiders believe the claw broke story is a lie. Think about it. If you actually stole the Soviet codebooks, would you announce it? No. You would tell the world, oops, we dropped it, so the Russians wouldn't change their codes. You would let them believe their secrets were safe at the bottom of the ocean, while you read their mail for the next decade. We will likely never know the truth. The only legacy we definitely have is the phrase, neither confirm nor deny. So the next time the government gives you a non-answer, just remember, they might be hiding aliens, they might be hiding incompetence, or they might just be hiding a giant claw machine that cost more than the GDP of a small country.